Mjølnerparken doesn't look like a slum, but the Danish government has officially classified this Copenhagen suburb as a ghetto.
We got a letter that we can't have any more residents here in Denmark. We are not allowed to be here anymore, and Danish government won't renew our residence.
Danish MPs voted by 70 to 24 to move refugees arriving on Danish soil to asylum centres in a partner country, potentially outside Europe.
I will be very frank. People come from coming outside who commit serious crimes and do not respect our value and way of life. I don't think they have a place in Europe.
This is Denmark, a country of just over 6 million people. For decades, it's been famous for being one of the happiest places on earth. Universal healthcare, free education, a society built on trust and equality. But recently, something changed. In 2021, Denmark's prime minister stood in front of parliament and said something that shocked the world. We can't promise zero asylum seekers, but we can set that vision and do what we can to implement it. Not fewer refugees, not stricter limits, zero asylum seekers, period. And she meant it. Denmark passed a law to ship asylum seekers to Rwanda, 6,000 kilometers away, so they'd never even set foot on Danish soil. They started seizing jewelry and cash from refugees at the border. They're demolishing entire neighborhoods to break up immigrant communities. They're forcing 1-year-old children in immigrant areas to attend mandatory daycare for 25 hours a week to learn Danish values, or their families lose welfare benefits. This isn't some far-right fringe party. This is the center-left Social Democrats, the party of the working class, the party that built Denmark's famous welfare state. And the Danish people, most of them love it. The Prime Minister's approval ratings hit record highs. So what happened? How did one of the world's most liberal countries become a fortress? Today, on Across the Globe, we're diving into the real story behind Denmark's war on immigration, the refugee surge that changed everything, the integration crisis that nobody wanted to talk about, and the shocking policies that have turned Denmark into a model for hardliners across the West. To put it bluntly, this is a story of a country going from open arms to closed borders. So let's trace back, because Denmark wasn't always like this. For most of its modern history, Denmark prided itself on humanitarian values. It was one of the first countries to sign the 1951 Refugee Convention, joining the likes of Australia, Belgium, and Germany. Like many European nations rebuilding after World War II, Denmark actively recruited guest workers in the 1960s and 70s, bringing in laborers from Turkey, Pakistan, and Yugoslavia to fill critical labor shortages. The assumption was simple. They'd work, earn money, and return home. But many didn't. They stayed, brought their families, and built lives in Denmark. Then, in 1983, Denmark passed one of the most generous immigration laws in Europe, giving asylum seekers strong protections and a real path to citizenship. So yes, for decades, Denmark quietly accepted UN quota refugees and welcomed diversity. Back in 1980, immigrants made up just 2.6% of Denmark's population. By 2025, that number had jumped to 12.6%, with another 3.7% being Danes born to immigrant parents. Nearly all of Denmark's population growth since 1980 has come from immigration. But here's the thing. This wasn't a gradual change that people got used to. It was a sudden shock that changed everything.
We're one of Europe's smallest countries. Welfare economy is under a lot of pressure. So we simply have to reduce the amount of people who travel up through Europe to specifically apply for asylum in Denmark.
The turning point came in 2015, the European migration crisis. Over 1 million asylum seekers flooded into Europe that year, fleeing wars in Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Denmark, a country of around 6,010,000, received 21,316 asylum applications in 2015 alone. To put that in perspective, Denmark received just 3,500 asylum applications in 2012, a 6-fold increase in 3 years. That's the most in the country's entire history. And the problem was, Denmark wasn't prepared. The system was truly overwhelmed. Small towns suddenly had refugee centers pop up overnight. The government quietly allowed thousands of migrants to transit through to Sweden, which had more generous policies at the time. But the ones who stayed, many came with limited education and no Danish language skills. Unlike the structured guest worker program in the past, there was no integration plan at this scale. They created a problem Denmark didn't know how to solve. By 2016, Denmark had reinstated border controls. They slashed refugee benefits. And then they did something extraordinary. They placed ads in Lebanese newspapers announcing they'd cut welfare for asylum seekers by 50%. The message was blunt. Don't come here. You won't find paradise. The doors were closing fast. But why? Why did a country known for generosity and openness suddenly turn so hostile? The truth is, Denmark had been struggling with immigration for years. They just hadn't been talking about it publicly. And when they finally did, the statistics were shocking. Denmark had accepted immigrants, mostly from the Middle East, North Africa, and Somalia, for decades. But integration wasn't working. Ethnic enclaves formed in Danish cities, communities where Danish wasn't the main language, where unemployment was high, education levels were low, and crime was a growing problem. The government started calling these areas ghettos, not as an insult, but an official designation. If a neighborhood had more than 50% non-Western immigrants and scored poorly on employment, education, and crime, it got labeled a ghetto. By 2018, Danish politicians were openly saying these immigrant-heavy districts were a threat to national unity. The government plan was titled A Denmark Without Parallel Societies, No Ghettos by 2030, explicitly framing these neighborhoods as threats to social cohesion and the welfare state. Prime Minister at the time, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, stated in his 2018 New Year's speech that ghettos could reach out their tentacles onto the streets by spreading violence, and that cracks have appeared on the map of Denmark. And the numbers backed up what he was saying. Immigrants made up about 14% of Denmark's population, but they accounted for 29% of violent crime convictions. That's more than double their share of the population. Then there was the cost. In 2018, Denmark's Ministry of Finance released a bombshell report. Immigrants from non-Western countries and their children cost Denmark a net 31 billion kroner. That's about 4.2 billion euros in a single year. Danish taxpayers were stunned. A relatively small immigrant population was creating a massive drain on the welfare state they'd spent generations building. But nothing made immigration feel more personal than housing. Denmark already had one of the most expensive housing markets in Europe. Prices were skyrocketing. Young Danes couldn't afford to buy homes. Renters were being squeezed out of cities. And then in 2025, a groundbreaking study came out. It found that over 60% of Denmark's house price boom since 1999 could be directly attributed to immigration-driven population growth. Think about that. More than half of the housing crisis blamed on immigration. The study showed that in areas where the immigrant population grew by just 1% over 5 years, home prices jumped 11% and rents rose 6%. Native Danes started moving out of immigrant-heavy neighborhoods, what researchers called white flight, which only spread the housing crunch to other areas. People were furious. Suddenly, immigration wasn't just an abstract political issue. It was personal. It was affecting where people could live, how much they got paid, whether they could afford a future in their own country. And there was a political earthquake brewing in the background. This is where Danish politics gets really interesting. For years, a far-right party called the Danish People's Party had been screaming about immigration. They were treated like fringe extremists. But in 2015, they won 21.1% of the vote and 37 seats in the Folketing, making it the second largest party in Denmark for the first time in its history. So now they were propping up the government and demanding stricter immigration policies. Here's the thing. Most countries would panic about this. The far right taking power, democracy in crisis. But Denmark did something different. The mainstream parties, including the center-left Social Democrats, looked at those election results and made a calculation. If we don't take this issue seriously, we'll lose everything. So they stole the far right's platform. Mette Frederiksen, the Social Democratic leader, had once criticized Denmark's immigration laws as the toughest in Europe. But by 2019, he was campaigning on a promise to stop immigration from non-Western countries entirely. And it worked. She won. Her approval ratings soared. And the far-right Danish People's Party, their vote share collapsed. Because why vote for the far right when the mainstream left is already doing what you want? Today, there's a rare cross-party consensus in Denmark. Both left and right agree. Minimize refugee intake, enforce strict integration, preserve Danish culture. It's not even controversial anymore. So what did Denmark actually do? How far did they go?
A Danish minister is defending plans to strip migrants of cash and valuables to pay for their keep.
Let's quickly run through some of the most shocking policies to paint a better picture. The jewelry law. In 2016, Denmark passed a law allowing police to confiscate cash and valuables from asylum seekers, anything worth more than about $1,500 to pay for their upkeep. The world called it the jewelry law and condemned it as inhumane. Denmark enforced it anyway. The ghetto package. In 2018, Denmark designated certain immigrant neighborhoods as official ghettos and created special rules. Immigrants living in these areas face double punishments for crimes. And here's the wildest part. Children as young as 1 year old are required to attend 25 hours per week of mandatory daycare to learn Danish values. Christmas, democracy, gender equality. If parents refuse, they lose welfare benefits. The government is literally forcing toddlers into state-run cultural training. This policy was so extreme that Denmark was hauled before the EU Court of Justice on charges of racial discrimination. Denmark's response? They defended it anyway. To them, breaking up these neighborhoods and forcing integration wasn't discrimination. It was necessary to preserve Danish society. Revoking Syrian refugees. In 2020, Denmark started revoking residence permits for Syrian refugees, claiming parts of Syria were now safe to return to. Hundreds of Syrians who'd lived in Denmark for years, learned the language, got jobs. They were told to go back or stay in deportation camps. Denmark became the first country in Europe to do this. The Rwanda Plan. Inspired by Australia's offshore detention model, Denmark passed a law in 2021 to send asylum applicants to Rwanda for processing. Not temporary detention, permanent processing. The idea is that no asylum seeker ever sets foot in Denmark. Ever. The plan passed Parliament 70-24. It's not some fringe idea, it's mainstream policy. Banning Islamic practices. Denmark banned full-face veils in public in 2018. They've proposed banning the call to prayer. They've cracked down on foreign imams. All in the name of preserving Danish values. Each of these policies is extreme on its own. Together, they paint a clear picture. Denmark is making itself as unwelcoming as possible. The message to asylum seekers is simple: don't come. So why is this happening now? What's the crucial question that needs answering to help all of this make more sense? After decades of relative tolerance, why the sudden shift? Well, it's not one thing. It's everything coming together at once. First, the welfare state. Danes are proud of their system. Free healthcare, free education, generous unemployment benefits. But it only works if everyone contributes. When they saw billions being spent on immigrants who weren't integrating, who weren't working, who were drawing more than they were putting in, they panicked. The math didn't work anymore. Second, security fears. Denmark is a safe country. Crime is low. But high-profile cases involving immigrants, gang violence in migrant neighborhoods, even terrorism, like the 2015 Copenhagen shooting by a Danish-born son of immigrants, left a mark. Many Danes started associating refugees with danger. Third, the parallel societies. This is a big one. Danes don't just want immigrants to live in Denmark. They want them to become Danish. Speak the language, share the values, integrate completely. When they saw neighborhoods where Danish wasn't spoken, where women wore face veils, where kids weren't celebrating Christmas, they saw their culture being eroded. They saw a future where Denmark wouldn't be Denmark anymore. And here's where it gets controversial. When the war in Ukraine started, Denmark welcomed over 41,000 Ukrainian refugees in 2022 and 2023. Quick residency permits, immediate support, no controversy. Why? Because Ukrainians are European. They're Christian. They're seen as culturally compatible. The contrast is stark. It started to look like Danes will welcome refugees as long as they're the right kind of refugees. And that's made the hardline stance feel justified to a lot of people. It's not about numbers, it's about culture. So there's one final question to try and answer here. What does the rest of the world think about all of this? Denmark's transformation has shocked the world. Human rights groups call the policies cruel. The UN says they're harsh and possibly illegal. But inside Denmark, there's barely any outcry. The crackdown is popular. Asylum applications dropped from over 21,000 in 2015 to just 2,095 in 2021. The government calls that a success. A YouGov poll from 2018 found that 65% of Danes were against accepting any more migrants. By 2022, 46% of Danes stated that they wanted no more or only a few Muslims making residency in their country. Mette Frederiksen's government argues they're being realistic. When people realize they will be sent out of Europe, they will stop coming, said one social democratic lawmaker defending the Rwanda plan. And they will stop putting themselves in danger, he added. Other countries are paying attention.
Now it seems there's a lot of more countries that have rallied around the notion that we should get democratic control of the migrant flows, and I'm just very, very happy that this is the case.
Denmark's strict immigration policies have found inspiration in Australia's Stop the Boats offshore processing model, and Denmark has been actively studying the Australian approach. Denmark's immigration minister even visited the controversial Nauru facility in 2024 to see how it works in practice. The UK designed its own offshore processing agreement with Rwanda by looking to Australia's model. And in 2021, Denmark became the first European country to pass legislation allowing it to transfer asylum seekers outside of Europe for processing. Denmark isn't an outlier anymore. It's helping shape a new European approach to migration. In conclusion, Denmark's war on immigration is one of the most intense political shifts in modern European history. A country famous for happiness, equality, and openness has become a fortress. They've gone from welcoming refugees to aiming for zero asylum seekers, from integration programs to demolishing immigrant neighborhoods, from a humanitarian leader to a hardline enforcer. And it's working, at least politically. The Danish people support it. The far right has collapsed because the mainstream adopted their policies. Other countries are following Denmark's lead. This is a story of a society that tried integration, decided it failed, and chose separation instead. It's a story of fear. Fear of losing a welfare state. Fear of losing cultural identity. Fear of losing control. Denmark made a choice. They decided the costs of an open society were too high. And now they're showing the rest of the West exactly how far a democracy will go when its people feel threatened. The question remains, is this the future, or is this a warning? What about how Portugal solved the immigration crisis?